So, this morning we're talking a little bit about grief and listening to our grief, as this is our last Sunday in October with our theme of deep listening. And grief can come in many forms, right? Sometimes it's grief of an item lost, sometimes it's grief around a transition in our lives. Sometimes it's grief around a dream that we have, that we are having to let go of. This morning, we're focusing mostly on the more traditional form of grief of when someone or something close to us has died. But I want you to hold any form of grief that is coming up for you present in this space. I'm guessing many of you are familiar, but maybe not all, with the common stages of grief: denial, anger, depression, and acceptance and bargaining. Anybody familiar with that? Yeah. There's a couple more. Sometimes shock and testing are also included in that list. And it used to be that we would talk about grief as moving through the stages one at a time to get to the place of healing. But our understanding about how grief works and what it is has changed over the years, so that now those types of grief, those stages of grief, we understand don't happen in any necessary order. And they can reoccur and come up over and over again in cycles. I remember when someone very close to me had died in my 20s, and I would go through waves of those stages where I would have anger and sadness and frustration and bargaining all in about a 5-minute span. And I'd cycle through it again. The trick with those stages is to ride those waves. We heard it this morning in those beautiful words, in language that the children can understand as well as us, and imagery that helps us understand what is happening as the waves crash over us, some staying a long time and others moving more quickly. But those waves and those crashes and the way we understand grief doesn't stay the same over time. I don't like to think about life as a linear event, but more as a spiral. And not a flat spiral, but a spiral with depth. In our lives, we may lose someone. Someone may die at a certain point on the spiral, and we are sent into the rhythm of grief. But we don't stay, if we are lucky, we don't stay circling in that same intense level of grief. The spiral changes and flows in new ways as our life goes on. But the grief never completely leaves. We come back around the spiral again, but in a new place, at a new depth of our own lives and experience. So while our culture, our general culture, often encourages us to hurry through grief and get over it, we know that's not really how it works. To honor those who have died and to get to a point where we can really remember the joy of their lives means we have to take time to revisit that grief in new ways and with new understandings in our life. To bring those stories up over and over again and hear what they have to teach us at where we are in our lives now. When we think of folks dying, it's one of those great mysteries, right? One of those great religious questions of what happens after death. And for me, it is one of the beauties of being a Unitarian Universalist that we don't try to answer that question for everyone. We come into this space with a variety of beliefs, or sometimes just ideas and possibilities about what happens after death. On those days where I am more grounded in science, I resonate with the idea that it is our bodies that go back into the earth, and the parts of us that made up this physical form don't disappear, but they transform into something new. And in that way, our selves and our bodies live on, but in a different form. On my more spiritual days, in those days in the hospital, where the mystery and wonder of things unexplainable happened around death, I feel like perhaps there is a spirit that continues on. Some part of us, beyond what we know how to measure with physical instruments. Some part of us that is, for some, a piece of God, for others, an unexplainable movement in the universe. And perhaps that continues as it is. Perhaps it merges back into the great unknown. Or for many of us, perhaps it is reincarnated again into a physical form. We bring all of those beliefs about what may happen after life and many more into this space together. It is beautiful that we don't have to agree on that piece of it, but what we do agree on is the living piece, the sharing of the stories as a continuation of the lives of those who have died. When someone is gone, they are not beyond our reach in terms of remembering who they were and imagining how they would be with us now as we are. Many people speak to the dead, whether that's at a graveside, at an altar in their homes, or just out on a walk in nature. All of those ways of being help us keep our loved ones with us in our lives. And they change as we grieve over time. So this morning, I'd like to invite you into a time of ritual and blessing. We read that story about the image of waves crashing over us, and water is something that has a lot of meaning in this place of merging waters. At the beginning of the year, we all bring our waters together in our water communion, and I have brought that water here today, having been boiled and run through a few filters. I would like to offer you a blessing, a water blessing for your grief, wherever it may be at. And we use this water in particular because grief is held in communities. Grief is one of those things that connects us as human beings, and witnessing to one another's grief is a sacred act. Listening to the stories of our ancestors, of those who have died, is a sacred act of witness in community that binds us to one another. So I invite you now to take a few minutes to meditate on water, And what kind of water resonates with where your grief is at? Then I will invite you to come up, and if you'd like to say a few words to me about your water and your grief where it is, or not say anything at all. I will dip a thumb in the water, and you can tell me if you'd like a blessing on your hand, on your forehead, or just a held hand up without a touch. When I've done the blessing in the room, I will log on to my computer and offer a blessing for those on Zoom individually as well. So meditate on the waters. I'm going to prime your thoughts with a few different images of water that may or may not resonate with you. Your grief may be like a still pool of water that holds us in the darkness. You may need a water blessing of rain that washes you away and pitter-patters. Or it may feel like a hot spring, a blessing of a hot spring that soothes the body and the spirit. You may need water that is like a sip to refresh you when you are feeling thirsty. You may need water like a river that is moving and changing and transforming. Or water like the ocean that brings wonder and awe at its vastness. You may even need the blessing of the water of waves, crashing and tumbling, or storms that feel like they are upheaving all around us. Perhaps the water blessing you need is your own tears to release the emotions that are stuck up in our bodies.